You can hear the applause before you see him. A single man in a silk robe, clapping for himself in a deserted theater, as if Rome were still watching. The air smells of burnt incense and rain-soaked marble. You realize the sound isn't celebration. It's the echo of a man trying to drown out his own silence. And before we follow him into that darkness, take a breath. Imagine watching this from wherever you are. A glowing screen in Karachi, a quiet room in Toronto, a midnight study in Rome itself. Every one of us is part of a strange audience, scattered across centuries, still watching the same performance. If you're here for stories where history breathes, where emperors bleed and ghosts still speak, subscribe, leave your mark, and tell us where you're watching from. Rome fell, but the echoes never stopped. He was 30 years old, emperor of the known world, and utterly alone. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, once the golden child of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, now stood before his own end like an actor refusing to leave the stage. In his final days, Rome was no longer his empire. It was his theater. Senators whispered of revolt, generals muttered treason, and beyond the palace walls, the Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to protect him, were negotiating his replacement. But Nero did not plan campaigns. He planned performances. At his villa on the Palatine Hill, he rehearsed lines from Orestes and Niobe, pacing in silk slippers while the empire burned outside his gates. The servants kept their eyes lowered as he practiced dying. Slow, poetic deaths, the kind that earned applause. "When I die," he once said, "may I die like an artist." The irony, of course, is that Rome was already dying for him. Rebellion ignited in Gaul. The legions in Spain declared for Galba, and letters of accusation poured into the Senate like poison. When Nero's secretary finally told him that the Senate had branded him a public enemy, the emperor blinked in disbelief. "Is it so?" he murmured, as if he had just forgotten a line in his own tragedy. He fled that night in disguise, wrapping a cloak over his tunic and pressing a rag to his face to hide his features. 4 companions went with him. A freedman, a few loyal slaves, and a trembling scribe who carried a small wooden box of coins and jewels. They rode through the dark gardens outside the city, the moon breaking through clouds like a pale witness. Nero looked back once. The city he had adorned with marble, filled with music and blood, was receding behind him, and no one followed. At dawn, they reached a villa on the outskirts belonging to Phaon, one of his few remaining allies. The emperor, his voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion, asked for water and a hiding place. Inside, the shutters were closed. The air was thick with damp straw and oil smoke. From somewhere nearby came the distant clatter of hooves, soldiers searching. Nero shuddered. "The sound of horsemen," he whispered. "They come for me." He demanded that a grave be dug in advance. "A resting place worthy of Nero," he said weakly, "where I may be buried whole." But his hands shook too much to lift the spade. Instead, he turned to his freedman, Epaphroditus, and murmured, "Have I neither friend nor foe left?" Outside, thunder rolled across the sky like applause. Inside, Nero wept, not for Rome, but for the world that would never again see him on stage. He begged for a dagger. His followers hesitated. "Cowards," he hissed, "is there no one to help me die?" Then, as the hoofbeats grew louder, he pressed the blade to his throat. "Qualis artifex pereo," he whispered, "what an artist dies in me." It was June 9th, 68 AD. The last of the Julio-Claudian emperors was gone. When the soldiers entered, they found a corpse barely recognizable. A man who had ruled an empire, now sprawled in mud and linen. There was no grand procession, no imperial funeral. His body was burned in secret by 2 women, former mistresses still bound by pity. The pyre flickered briefly in the dawn, then vanished into smoke. But the city's silence was stranger than grief. Rome, which had once trembled under his command, now moved on as if nothing had happened. The Senate issued decrees. The streets returned to commerce, and Nero's name was scratched from monuments. Yet among the people, something persisted. A rumor, soft as prayer. Some swore they saw him in the east, singing beneath the stars of Greece. Others claimed he sailed for Parthia, gathering armies. Nero had been a performer his whole life. Perhaps death itself was only his final act. In taverns and theaters, the stories grew. They said he would return, that the lyre would sound again, that Rome's golden voice had only gone silent for a season. Even when new emperors rose, they ruled under the weight of that ghost. And so, history's cruelest applause began. Not from Rome's citizens, but from time itself. Every tyrant who followed him heard the echo. The man who burned his city sang over its ashes and died applauding his own destruction. The stage was empty now, but the performance was far from over. For if death could not bury Nero, what hope did the empire itself have? You stand at an empty grave, the marble cracked, the inscription half erased, and realize no one ever found the body. The wind carries dust through the ruins, whispering his name like a question that refuses to die. Somewhere beneath these stones, history should have ended. Instead, it began again, in whispers and shadows. When Nero died, Rome should have been finished with him. The tyrant was gone, the Senate rejoiced, and the empire had a new master. Yet his death felt unfinished, a story that refused its own conclusion. There was no corpse paraded through the forum, no ashes placed in the imperial tomb. Just a rumor that Nero, the mad emperor, the singer who watched his city burn, had not truly perished. For a man who made every moment a performance, it was fitting. His final act was to vanish. The freedwoman Act, who claimed to have burned his body, said she did so quietly, under cover of night. Only a handful of witnesses saw the pyre, and by morning the ashes were gone. No one could point to the grave. No one could swear the emperor was truly dead. The vacuum left behind was not peace. It was theater. Within months, in the ports of Asia Minor, sailors swore they had seen Nero alive. He had escaped Rome, they said, and crossed the Aegean disguised as a musician. Others whispered he had found refuge in Parthia, Rome's ancient enemy, and that the Eastern kings had crowned him anew. Historians would later call it Nero redivivus. Nero returned. But to the men and women of the first century, it was something stranger. Not a myth, but a possibility. They had seen too much of his spectacle to believe it could end in silence. The empire, vast and uncertain, clung to his ghost like a habit it couldn't break. In the year 69, the first of the false Neros appeared. He came from the Aegean Islands, a young man with the emperor's voice and the same curling hair. Crowds gathered to see him perform songs only Nero had sung. Even the Parthian king Tiridates received him, intrigued by the resemblance. Rome trembled. Could its monster truly have returned? When the impostor was captured and executed, his head was sent to the capital, a trophy of disbelief. But it didn't end. A second Nero emerged years later, this one claiming divine protection. He sang to the crowds in the marketplaces of Asia, dressed in purple robes, surrounded by fanatics who called him the true Caesar. He too was hunted and killed, yet still the myth survived. By the time of the third impostor, decades later, the belief had hardened into prophecy. In the eastern provinces, poets spoke of Nero's return not with fear, but fascination. "He shall come again from beyond the Euphrates," one oracle proclaimed, "to reclaim the world." Even early Christians whispered his name in dread, reading him into the book of Revelation, the beast who would rise again to torment the nations. How did an emperor so despised become immortal in rumor? Perhaps because his reign had already blurred the line between divinity and performance. Nero had been worshipped in his lifetime, adored in the East as Apollo reborn. He had sung of his own death on stage, wept at his own fictional funerals, and demanded temples to his genius. When such a man disappeared, how could the world accept that it was over? In Rome, senators scoffed at the idea of his resurrection, yet even they refused to speak his name aloud. His statues were toppled, but not destroyed. His palace, the Golden House, was buried under new construction, yet the people still walked above it in fear. The empire tried to erase him, but erasure only deepened his mystery. A century later, travelers still claimed to hear songs in the ruins of his gardens. Fragments of music carried on the wind. "It is the emperor's spirit," said one pilgrim, "singing to the moon." By the 4th century, Nero had ceased to be a man. He was a symbol of corruption, of divine punishment, of the eternal return of evil disguised as beauty. In the medieval imagination, he became something worse. Chroniclers described him as the Antichrist, the dark reflection of Christ's resurrection. His missing body was proof enough. The wicked cannot die, they only sleep. Church sermons warned of his return at the end of days, not as emperor, but as the embodiment of Rome's sins reborn. His name became a cipher, his number the mark of the beast. 666, the sum of Nero Caesar. And yet, beneath all the fear in Scripture, something deeply human lingered. The people who once adored him had turned him into a story they couldn't let go. Perhaps they needed him. The monster they could blame, the artist they could mourn. Rome had birthed him, destroyed him, and then, unable to live without him, resurrected him in legend. Even now, the tomb remains unmarked. Archaeologists have searched the ancient necropolises of the Vatican Hill, the catacombs of the Via Salaria, the forgotten vaults of Phaon's Villa. But the emperor's bones are nowhere. A marble fragment here, a charred urn there, nothing that can silence the rumor. Because Nero's true burial was never in stone. It was in the mind of an empire that could not stop hearing his song. And if you stand long enough among the ruins, you might hear it too, faint, mocking, and almost tender. A voice whispering from the dust, "Did you really think I was gone?" You hear it before you smell the smoke. A low, trembling melody carried over the ashes of a dying empire. It sounds almost human, yet too calm for a city on fire. Somewhere beyond the flames, someone, or something, is still performing, as if refusing to let the curtain fall. Long after Nero's death, Rome could not silence the music he left behind. His name had been cursed, his memory condemned, his palaces filled in with earth. Yet his spirit seeped into everything that followed. The empire that called him mad had learned to love the madness. Bread and circuses became law, and the theater of blood outlived the republic that once despised it. Nero, in dying, had taught Rome what it was willing to pay to feel alive. The emperors who succeeded him pretended to restore dignity. But beneath their reforms, Nero's reflection remained. Domitian, decades later, styled himself as divine performer and God King, demanding crowds cheer his poetry as if it were sacred scripture. Caligula had shown Rome cruelty. Nero gave it rhythm. And when the people shouted their approval, they weren't just applauding an emperor. They were applauding the echo of Nero's voice. In marble halls and open-air amphitheaters, art itself became imperial propaganda. Poets like Lucan and Statius wrote of heroes who burned cities in the name of destiny. Painters filled their frescoes with golden light, not the sun's glow, but the shimmer of firelight. The empire's beauty turned theatrical, its politics a script written in blood. How could it not? The man who sang while Rome burned had given destruction an aesthetic. Centuries passed, and still the world could not forget him. In the fading decades of the Roman Empire, Christian scholars debated his soul. Augustine of Hippo wrote of the arrogance that destroys nations from within. He never named Nero, but the shadow was there. In the catacombs beneath the city, early Christians painted their fears in secret. Beasts with 7 heads, serpents wrapped in crowns, and a nameless figure crowned in flame. The Antichrist wore Nero's face. Even emperors who claimed to despise him found themselves imitating his drama. When Commodus entered the arena dressed as Hercules, roaring before the crowds, it was Nero's ghost he was channeling, the emperor who made spectacle an instrument of power. When Elagabalus married the sun god in full ceremony, draped in gold and perfume, the audience of Rome murmured a name that had not been spoken aloud for centuries. Nero had never truly died. He had become an archetype. The artist tyrant, the doomed performer, the man who mistook applause for love. But the most haunting survival of Nero's legacy wasn't in palaces or rituals. It was in the people. The mob that once trembled before him learned to crave the very chaos he embodied. Gladiatorial games grew bloodier, chariot races deadlier, the laughter louder. Rome, once built on discipline, became addicted to its own spectacle. The empire fed on distraction until the barbarian drums echoed at its gates, and even then the games continued. As the 5th century drew near, the empire's edges began to rot away. Provinces fell, legions deserted, marble cracked. Yet poets still wrote verses about lost glory and doomed beauty, all haunted by the same rhythm Nero had given the world: destruction as art. When Alaric's Visigoths stormed the city in 410 AD, the witnesses wrote that Rome burned again. The words were not metaphor, and somewhere in the imaginations of those survivors, one could almost hear the old emperor laughing. Even as the Western Empire turned to dust, Nero's story refused to rest. Medieval scribes retold his legend not as history, but as a warning. To them, he was the eternal fire behind every tyrant's throne, the first man to confuse power with performance. Chroniclers in cloisters painted him with blackened eyes and golden robes, surrounded by flames that could never be quenched. The singers of the Middle Ages gave him new verses, hymns of damnation disguised as remembrance. His lyre became the devil's instrument. Yet, paradoxically, the Renaissance revived him with fascination. Painters rendered him in soft chiaroscuro, a tragic figure of youth undone by excess. Playwrights in Italy and England wrote his name again, this time as art. "What an artist dies in me," he had said, and now he had become art itself. In every portrait of a fallen ruler, every tragic king who mistook his reflection for a crown, Nero's soul flickered. By the modern age, he had transcended morality altogether. To some, he was the symbol of absolute corruption. To others, the embodiment of rebellion against an unforgiving world. Historians debated whether he was villain or victim, madman or misunderstood visionary. Yet every version carried the same refrain, the song that began in fire and ended in legend. And so, Rome's last song was not its anthem of triumph, but Nero's melody of ruin. The empire did not fall in a single moment. It decayed, beautifully, theatrically, as though following his final performance. Each century repeated the same act with new costumes and scripts, power rising, art decaying, applause fading. As night settles over the ruins of the Palatine Hill, the silence feels rehearsed. The wind moves through the broken columns like breath through a flute. Somewhere in that hollow music the emperor still performs, unseen, unburied, unforgettable. And if you listen closely, across time and empire, you might still hear it, the faint hum of a man who sang while the world burned, and taught the world to keep singing as it died.